Welcome everyone. I'm Dr. Jane Mackie. I'm the head of Otonabee College, and I'm also a faculty member in the nursing department here at Trent. We're getting together tonight to do the Otonabee College Trent Talks. We're going to be talking about some strategies to help folks manage stress. I became interested in stress primarily through the teaching side of what I'm doing. I teach one of the more challenging courses for students in the nursing program is their pharmacology course. And over the 18 years that I've been teaching, I've noticed the level of anxiety in students getting higher and higher every year. Not really sure what this is. We can explore some ideas, but it seems that the demands of being a student have become more and more stressful. So one of my interests is looking at some of the ways that we can help students to manage stress, ways that are pretty simple and things that they can incorporate into their life to try and manage stress in order to be successful at their academics. It's become pretty clear that not managing your stress properly, having lots of stress, can make students really have a negative impact on their academics. So tonight we're going to look at a series of different ways to manage stress. I'm going to talk a little bit about the benefits of music. We're going to talk about the benefits of sleep, which we all like to do. We're going to talk about physical activity, and we're going to look at relationships. And then we're going to finish up with sort of the end result of not managing your stress all that well. We're going to look at what we can do when we want to frankly have a discussion with someone about the risk of suicide or whether they have that on their mind. So what I'm going to do is first of all give a little bit of an introduction about stress and the impacts that we see happening. Then I will talk, as I said, a little bit about music, and then we'll move through the other groups. So when we look at stress, everybody's pretty familiar with stress. We all know that stress is a negative thing. It causes us problems, it causes anxiety, but what is stress? Really, what's going on in the body? When we look at stress, we know that there are physiologic changes that happen. But what people sometimes forget is stress actually happens for a positive reason. Our stress response is something that saves our life, right? If we leave here and we get out of this room and we discover that while we spent the 2 hours in here together, the zombie apocalypse has occurred and there are people out there who are shuffling down to eat us for dinner, then what happens? We have our stress response. It becomes activated. Our heart beats faster, we breathe faster, blood gets into our body so that we can run away from that particular stress. So the stress response is actually important and protective. It's when we get into too much stress that it becomes an issue for us. It's kind of like the Goldilocks principle that we used to talk about as kids. A little bit of stress is helpful, too much is not good, absence of stress isn't good. If we have no stress, we won't actually get out of bed in the morning. We need our body's stress response to help us jump out of bed when the alarm clock starts to happen. So it's about trying to help people manage their stress. And stress is controlled pretty simply in the brain by this little tiny part of the brain called the amygdala. It's about the size and shape of an almond. So when that sits in the brain, it looks at the environment and interprets that threat and then talks to higher centers in the brain to make us fearful or anxious. So we see the zombie, the amygdala senses that, decides it's a threat, and connects to those processes to release our stress hormones. And everybody knows what those stress hormones are probably, right? Everybody's sort of epinephrine or adrenaline. And we've also probably are pretty familiar with cortisol. Epinephrine or adrenaline causes those short-term changes in stress. Makes our heart beat faster, our lungs better, opens up our eyes so we can see where the threat is coming from. Cortisol is those slower things. The role of cortisol is make sure that there's sugar in the blood to feed the brain so the brain can think the way out of the problems that we're having. So those two things both contribute to our stress response. So when we look at our stress response, we want to think about why is that happening too much in the amygdala? Why are these hormones so high? And what are the long-term negative impacts? We know really probably the most powerful current theory in health is that too much stress causes most of the diseases we look at, right? It causes hypertension, it causes diabetes. What I'm particularly interested in is the link of stress and the mental health issues that we are becoming very concerned with in academics. If I can sort of paraphrase one of the great Zen masters of time, Yoda said, stress leads to anxiety, Anxiety leads to depression. Depression leads to suicide. So we want to kind of break up this and figure ways to healthily manage our stress. So what kind of ways can we do this? Using strategies that lower our stress hormones, right? And the one that I'm particularly interested in is the use of music. Now, this may sound kind of anecdotal, right? Everybody sort of knows that music makes you feel good, music makes you feel happy, it can increase your heart rate, make you excited, but there's actually a whole body of science that looks at music and looks at how we can use it to reduce stress. A lot of this is around music therapy, which is a pretty growing area to help folks with depression. But what I'd like to sort of look at is how we can use music, and we actually can, how we can use music in our everyday lives to try and help reduce our stress. So what's the basis behind this? Why is music helpful? Music, as you know, exists almost everywhere in some type. There's music in the animal kingdom, right? We talk about whale song, we talk about dolphin song, we talk about the singing dogs, right? I don't know if anyone's ever visited the singing dogs in the zoo in Toronto. They sing a lot better than I do in reality, but there are different pieces of the animal kingdom that are involved in music and song. Music has been around through the ages. They're little flute-like instruments that we can find when we look at ruins and burial sites for Neanderthal men, for Cro-Magnon men. So music has been there as part of our life. When we get into sort of more of an anecdotal situation, think about what parents do when they have children who are anxious, and we're building these relationships as we talk about. What do we do when we have a crying baby? We do two things, right? We do this all the time, right? Even standing in the line, but we also sing, or whatever it is that we do. We sing, we hum, or we croon, drawing on this power in the brain that music has to lower the anxiety and stress that we're feeling. So I want to look sort of at the science of what's happening behind this. If we think about stress for students or for people, really, right, the occupation of a student is to do their academics, so we can look at this really for any occupation, but what happens is we have in reality performance anxiety, don't we, when we get stressed out. So when we have this highly stressful situation, what happens is the brain actually rewires itself to interfere with our ability to do what we want to do. We know a lot about this when we think about elite athletes, right? So you have someone who's training for the Olympics. I'll pick swimming because we have lots of swimming that happens around me. So you have someone who's training for the Olympics. They've worked for years and years and years to do this. They get to that final event, and what happens? They choke, right? We're all familiar with that term, choking. Choking in the brain, at this case, is really about the fact that too many stress hormones in that instant before you're trying to perform to your best actually interferes with the wiring in the brain and changes the ability of the brain to access the information on how to swim the 50-meter backstroke as fast as you possibly can. It stops your ability to do what you know how to do. And in academics, it's exactly the same. Think about it, right? You're sitting there, you're all prepared, you've studied for ages and ages for a particular test, right? You walk in the door, you sit down, everyone's buzzing, you talk to the wrong people beforehand, and you have that same situation. You experience that interference. The stress hormones that are there rewire your brain and close the doors for you to access that information that you just spent such a long time learning. So I want to talk about how we can use music to try and overcome that. And it's pretty simple. First things, we've been looking at music, studying music, actually from a scientific basis. It may surprise you to know that people have been doing studies around what music does to the body since the 1800s. They found that music will lower your heart rate. It will lower your blood pressure. So it's impacting those stress hormones and decreasing the stress that you feel in the body. And when your heart starts to race, that makes you feel more anxious, right? So you listen to some music, and it can help to reduce that. There were studies done in the 1940s that showed that when we put phonographs, right, remember those old-fashioned things called record players back in the old days, when we put record players into operating rooms, This decreases the amount of analgesia that patients needed to go to sleep, decreases the amount of pain medications they need, because this is decreasing the stress that they feel. So there are clear links to the use of music and reducing the stress hormones and the productions of stress hormones in the brain. And if we can harvest that, keep those stress hormones low, then again, we're preventing that long-term system that goes ahead and causes problems and mental illnesses. So the first use that we want for music is to go ahead and try and do that. So we know it reduces stress hormones. But there's actually a really interesting thing that happens as well. The brain, besides producing those stress hormones, also produces a number of chemicals that we think of as the happy hormones, right? Or the happy chemicals in the brain. You might have heard of serotonin and dopamine. We talk about serotonin lots of times associated with anxiety and depression. So when we feel stressed, we actually go out and do things to try and boost the levels of these happy hormones. So what do I mean by that? So you're feeling stressed or depressed or burned out from what you're doing, unhappy. What do? You go and you eat a bag of potato chips, right? Or you eat a big bowl of ice cream, and that actually in the body raises levels of serotonin to try and make you feel better. So we're looking for behaviors. Music also can increase levels of serotonin in the brain without helping us to eat too much. And we might even move a little bit to that music, which helps us to use up the calories that we're doing. So serotonin, it boosts those levels of those hormones in the brain. The other thing that music clearly does is boost the levels of dopamine. Dopamine is a little bit more complex. Dopamine is involved in what we call the reward pathway. So when we're feeling unhappy, when we have undiagnosed mental illness, for example, we start to take on lots of behaviors to go ahead and raise the levels of dopamine in the brain ourselves. Dopamine, it takes a more powerful stimulus than eating a bag of chips to raise dopamine levels. For example, sex raises dopamine levels, shopping raises dopamine levels, right? So we have people looking at the shopping channel and buying all those things. There's a reason that we shop in excess when we feel unhappy. It's boosting dopamine levels. Nicotine, other recreational drugs, very powerful boosters of dopamine levels. All of those, as you can see, are sort of linked to addictive behaviors, things that we don't necessarily want to do. The beauty of music is music can also boost dopamine levels, but it does it in a fairly harmless way. Sure, lots of parents will say, my kid is addicted to their iPhone, or their iPad. No, what is it? iPod. There it is. Addicted to their iPod. They've got the earbuds in the ear all the time listening to music. But I know as a parent, that's a lot better addiction than some of those other choices that we talked about. So music actually boosts levels of dopamine in the brain in that complex way to go ahead and help us feel better and relieve our stress. So there's very clear indication that music, simple as it is, can effectively help us feel better and reduce our stress. In fact, there's a prescription that I came across as I was looking at this. If we go ahead and listen to music for 30 minutes twice a day, this can help us to manage and reduce our stress on an ongoing basis. So not only is it a good idea to listen to it when you're prepping for something, you got a big assignment. Lots of kids study, for example, with lots of music going on in the background. That's helping them stay focused. I know for me, I do the same. People who have an office near mine will sometimes be somewhat disturbed by the music that's coming out of my office. It's usually not that quiet because it helps me stay focused on what I'm doing and less distracted and less anxious about getting things done. And music can do that. So music is a pretty effective, pretty simple way to help us deal with some of our anxiety. But the next question is, what kind of music should we listen to? And here's where it gets a little bit interesting. I'm not going to lie to you. I'm going to say the best music to listen to is Mozart, classical music, right? There are studies that listening to Mozart right before you write a test actually helps you to perform better on that test. Students in grade school, grade 3 or 4, when they're writing math tests, if there's music in the background, they'll do a little bit better on those math tests. So it is helping the processing. Mozart, classical music isn't everyone's cup of tea, right? If you're more likely to want to listen to Thunderdome from AC/DC, the good news is The second best type of music is your favorite choice, whatever that choice is. So if you like classical, you win on both accounts because the classical music is the best. But the most important thing is to pick your own music that you connect to in order to take the benefit of it. And that makes sense, right? If you think about music, music is very often associated with some of our happiest memories. What do we do when we get together? We sing happy birthday, we sing Christmas carols, we do whatever. And that helps us to feel happy and together as well with the folks that we're with. So the type of music is fairly important. It has to be music you like. If you are a heavy metal fan and someone makes you listen to classical music, it will actually increase your stress hormone production. So you have to be a little careful with that. The key pieces seem to be about regular beat, right? The best types of music have a beat very similar to the human heart, like a mom that, again, is holding that baby. So what does the link seem to be with music? Well, if you think about stress and noise, one of the most startling things that can happen to you, causes the biggest response, is a loud noise, right? And what happens when you hear that loud noise? Stress hormones raise and you jump. There's a direct link between the ear and the amygdala, that center of the brain that causes fear and anxiety, and the cerebellum, which controls muscle movement. So at the same time as we look out, we see something in the environment that's threatening, and our brain starts to process it, we also start to move at the same time. So the connection with noise is we're using that very basic connection to help us. The issue about the kind of music is important, but it's also a question, should you listen to music? Should you play music? What's the best way to take advantage of this? Listening to music is great. That passive experience gives you the benefit. But the other thing that's important for you to know is making music is also important. So it's that singing in the shower, right? You get up in the morning and you're feeling a little blue. You put a happy face on the world. You start to sing in the shower. That will help you to feel better as you actually make that music. It doesn't have to be beautiful music, just music that makes you happy. Playing an instrument, learning to play an instrument actually stimulates processing in the brain as well. So playing an instrument, right? So you're sitting there and as a student, you're trying to decide between finishing an assignment or going to practice with the band that you have in your next door neighbor's garage, right? Best advice actually is go play your music for a little while. That will help you, and when you get back, you'll be a lot more effective at doing what you're supposed to be doing. So music can be a big part of helping us to reduce our stress, manage our stress, to prevent those long-term outcomes. But the important thing is you pick the type of music that you like, and again, try to listen to it. It's usually not that hard a thing. Try to listen to it a couple of times a day in order to help you. It will reduce your stress, help you long-term, and actually improve your academic performance as well. And we can apply this to art, too. If music isn't your thing, you can be an artist. You can knit, you can crochet. I crochet in meetings all the time. People think it's very strange, but again, it distracts my brain that's worrying about things so I can focus on what I'm doing. So there's a lot of science behind the healing power of the arts, like music, in order to help us manage our stress. Thank you.